Um, just to let you know that this is a webinar presentation by Dr. Alireza Doostdar from Chicago University. This is a presentation as part of Iran Colloquium organized by Yale Iranian Studies Program in collaboration with the Macmillan Center as one of our host institutions. I wanted, before everything, also to extend my gratitude to Council on Middle East Studies of Yale University. And special thanks also I wanted to extend to Iran Daroudi, the great Iranian artist who gave us her permission to use one of her paintings on our series poster. So we look forward to have questions from all the attendees after Dr. Doostdar's presentation. I'll do my best to answer as many as of them. But you should know that it is sometimes hard to do. A few words about our great presenter, Dr. Doostdar. He is currently a professor at Chicago University's Department of Divinity. He is a graduate, he got his PhD from Harvard University Department of Anthropology. I personally have been following his work for so many years, and we have seen the new things coming up each time, surprising us. Dr. Doostdar, I would say that his work is marked by very creative form of interdisciplinary way of doing his research and in his writing. He very easily navigates between different methodologies, some that are somewhat known to the discipline of anthropology, but he moves very easily between interviews to textual analysis, to media analysis, and so on. His book, The Iranian Metaphysicals, Explorations in Science, Islam, and the Uncanny, was published by the Princeton University Press in 2018. And it received the Albert Hourani Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association. I will not take your time much longer, and I will pass it on to Dr. Doostdar.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Fadwood, for that really nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to be with all of you, even though it's not as under the circumstances we perhaps would have liked, although there are upsides, like being able to have presenters and participants from all over the world. So I'm really grateful to be here, grateful to Fadwood for making this possible, also to Nahid Siamdoust, who initiated a conversation about my visit to Yale a long time ago now, and it's thankfully now come to fruition. Thanks also to Marwa Khabour and Kristen Siebert for doing all that they've done for making this possible. What I'll be doing today is speaking about a new book project about Satan and the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the way in which the theology of Satan has developed and moved in different directions since before the revolutionary period and up to the present moment. It's a work in progress, so I'm going to be presenting to you arguments that are at least in part still tentative. So I really look forward to the Q&A. I would benefit from your comments and questions. Hopefully, I'll be working on this for the next year or so, and if all the stars align, this will be something that I'll be submitting to the press in about a year's time. So I'm going to share my screen here so that you can see the PowerPoint. At certain points, you'll be seeing some film clips, and hopefully the audio will work for you. Let's see, let me just make sure I have everything here. Okay, I assume that everything is set right now. When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran from exile in February 1979 to lead the revolution to victory, his followers broadcast an anthem on radio and television whose chorus had been composed centuries earlier by the Sufi poet Hafiz. Div cho birun ravad, ferishte darayad. When the demon leaves, the angel shall enter. The dualistic vision of the poem, opposing the Shah's demon to Khomeini's angel, presented a neat summary of his program: a total reorientation of Iranian society away from satanic vice and toward angelic virtue. Over 4 decades later, this fundamental antagonism remains at the core of the Islamic Republic's political theology. But a deeper ambiguity lies hidden below the surface of this opposition. Just who or what is Satan, and what does it mean to defeat him? My new book project answers these questions by attending to the complex manifestations of the Accursed One across time and within diverse fields of experience. The book is a work of historical anthropology that draws on a wide range of texts, including theological and mystical treatises, religious sermons, and news reports, but also other sources like ethnographic observations, interviews, and audiovisual media, which include spiritual television shows, revolutionary songs, and rock and heavy metal music. And if you stay till the end of this presentation, you'll hear some heavy metal music from Iran. The story that I tell in this book is about a tense revolutionary unity that suffers dispersion and fragmentation over time. This is a story that applies not just to Satan and conceptions of the satanic, but to the Iranian revolution more broadly. In the span of a few decades, a powerful yet strained political community committed to spiritual self-transformation under Khomeini's leadership gave way to an increasingly fractured polity and a scattering of religious and political energies. Satan offers a rare vantage point on these shifts by illuminating the political theological currents that circulate in public, yet have tended to evade the gaze of observers. At stake is a theological uncertainty over the variability of humans to make their own history, and to do so in a way that accords with God's plan. Ultimately, it may be a question of whether a pious revolutionary agent can be an agent at all without, at the same time, entering a dangerous dance with the devil. In its engagement with Satan, my book takes theological inquiry seriously, both as an ethnographic object and a critical interlocutor. As an object of ethnographic analysis, I consider theology as one mode of discourse among others, not only the specialized epistemic preserve of theologians, but knowledge that circulates through diverse domains of inquiry and action among non-theologians and theologians alike. As an ethnographic object, theology is multiple. It is subject to historical change and prone to unexpected turns. Some theological formulations carry the seeds of transformations that end up undermining their original impetus. Ayatollah Khomeini's Satan, for example, was the product of a synthesis between mystical philosophy, ethics, and political practice. He managed to hold this complex assemblage together partly because he possessed a uniquely compelling voice as spiritual and political leader. In the years after his death, each component of Khomeini's synthesis took on a life of its own and came to stand at odds with the others, and with itself. My book argues that by attending to such inchoate possibilities, scholars can train themselves to be sensitive to the ways in which theological concepts develop political lives that can never be fully determined by their authors. As a work of political theology, my book attends to the possibility that political concepts, emotions, and attitudes may emerge from realms of theological thought and practice, which is to say, engagements with non-human agents that are irreducible to conflicts over status, resources, and values. To do this political theological work, I approach theology not only as an ethnographic object, but also as a critical interlocutor. Here, theology is a mode of inquiry that, like anthropology, is committed to theoretical reflection and ethical engagement with humans and their worlds. As Islamic accounts of Satan are multiple, I set up my anthropological conversation with theology in a manner that strives to learn the most from its multiplicity. My aim is to open a pathway for anthropology to think with Satan, to reevaluate the challenges humans face when they strive toward a common ideal. So in other words, the work that I'm trying to do is, there's the kind of commonplace mode of anthropology and history that I'm trying to do in the book project, but I'm also trying to work with theology to do theology in the work in a sense, which I'm not the first to do. There are other anthropologists who've done this. I'm experimenting in doing that with the revolution in particular. So for the rest of this presentation, I'll offer an overview of some of Satan's manifestations over the past few decades. I begin with how Satan was conceived by two revolutionary leaders, Ayatollah Khomeini and Ali Shariati. I will then describe several newer expressions of the theology of Satan with an eye toward both divergences and resonances with Khomeini and Shariati's work. In the early revolutionary period, Ayatollah Khomeini articulated a complex image of Satan as at once a political foil, an ethical diagnostic, and a negative sign for mystical insight. The ethical Satan was a staple of Khomeini's thought well before the revolution. In his commentary on 40 Hadith, which he wrote in 1939 at the age of 37, Satan and his armies appear as stubborn enemies for the spiritual aspirant on the path of self-purification. Early in his book, Khomeini advises the spiritual struggler to devise a daily plan of vowing, examining, and accounting, which is musharate, muraqabeh, and muhasabeh. At the beginning of the day, aspirants are to vow with themselves that they will not behave in ways that go against the word of God. Afterward, and for the duration of the day, they are to examine themselves to ensure that they abide by their vow. By night, they are to hold themselves to account, asking whether they have upheld or betrayed their vow. Satan and his armies may appear at the vowing or examining stages. In both cases, Khomeini advises aspirants to curse Satan and his armies, cast false delusions out of their heart, and proceed with determination. This notion of this notion of Satan as ethical obstacle remained central to Khomeini's thought throughout his career. In a speech to seminary students in Najaf in 1965, for example, he said that the accursed Satan wanted to deceive mankind and lead him to unbelief, a challenge that should be confronted with relentless self-examination and vigilant struggle against vice. You should see the quote on your page. Whenever one takes a step in the direction of acquiring knowledge, he said, one must take at least one step, if not two steps, in the purification of morals, in solidifying convictions, in establishing faith in the heart. This requires thinking. It requires calculation. It requires self-examination. The gentlemen, meaning you, the audience, need to examine themselves. They need to care for themselves from dawn to dusk. The human soul is unruly. If we neglect it for one moment, we seek refuge in God. It, meaning the soul, will drag man to unbelief, not only to iniquity. Satan is not satisfied with our iniquity. He wants our unbelief. He wants to lead everyone to unbelief, but he begins with small sins and little by little leads to bigger sins until it gets to a point where, God forbid it, he leads men entirely away from Islam. We see in this passage that Khomeini established a connection, if not an equivalence, between Satan and the soul that commands to evil, nafs ammare. We can think of the soul commanding to evil as a kind of inner Satan, while outer Satans whisper and insinuate in ways that reinforce the internal deviator. As the revolutionary movement gathered momentum over a decade later, Khomeini's articulation of Satan took on an increasingly explicit political valence. By the summer of 1978, he had inserted a plurality of Satans into political discourse. These were humans with a satanic nature who were bent on deceiving and seducing the strugglers on God's path to lead them toward vice, discord, and finally, defeat. He included the Shah in this plurality, declaring, for example, that his stated attempt at national reconciliation was a satanic ruse, neirange shaitani. Soon thereafter, he included the American military in the Satanic Collective. Then in November of the same year, 2 months after the Black Friday massacre, he turned his attention directly to US President Jimmy Carter, ridiculing his apparent concern for human rights in Iran as the teaching of Iblis. And for those of you who don't know much about Islamic theology, Iblis and Satan are usually associated with one another. They're usually equated. That's not always the case, but in contemporary Iran, most of the time, in public discourse at least, there is an association. This demonization of powerful politicians prefigured Khomeini's use of the term Great Satan soon after the revolution. He appears to have uttered the phrase in public for the first time in May 1979, but in the plural. The Great Satans he had in mind seemed to include the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, world powers that were pulling the strings of lesser local Satans who pushed for alternatives to the Islamic Republic. Over time, Khomeini reduced the plurality of Great Satans to a singular Great Satan, his well-known epithet for the United States of America. But even so, he continued to maintain an alternative sense for the Great Satan as Iblis. For example, he would utter prayers protecting everyone from the evil of the Great Satan and those who follow him, as well as from the evil of the soul that commands to evil, a juxtaposition that was well in line with the ethical conception of Satan and did not have to be reduced to a castigation of the United States. Now, while expanding his political demonology, Khomeini held on to a mystical conception of Satan as an evil disposition that distorted the human soul. About 1 month before the revolution's victory, while still in France, Khomeini responded to the Shah's complaint that the people did not truly understand or appreciate him. The Shah had said, the reason for the protests and the riots and so on is that people don't truly understand who I am and what I've done for them. Khomeini acknowledged that this was correct in a way that could only be grasped through mystical theology. That is, humans' true nature could never be revealed in the material world. Once the veil of materiality was lifted with death, he said, it will be possible to see individual humans in the form of animals or Satans, depending on their sedimented, enduring dispositions. So he essentially turned to what the Shah was saying against himself. He's saying, yes, people can't really see how evil you are, right, as long as everybody's alive. So this is what he said. You will see a human with 10 enduring dispositions appear in 10 forms. He is one, but his dispositions are aligned. His lustful animality is so dominant that he appears in the form of a lustful animal like the pig. The form of his viciousness is also very dominant, the way that exists in animals, like the panther, for example. And his mischief, deceptions, and ruses are great. Here, when the page turns, he is fully Satan. And at the same time that he has a satanic form, he also has a vicious form, the highest stage of viciousness. And he also has a lustful animal form, the highest stage of lust. He appears in these different forms. The most remarkable point in this passage is that Khomeini thought there was a satanic form that could be perceived after death in much the same way as one might perceive the appearance of an animal. Given his training in mystical philosophy, he probably believed that humans gifted with divine extrasensory perception could sometimes see these forms in their waking lives. If you've seen my book, The Iranian Metaphysicals, the third part of the book on the Friends of God, there's actually discussion of this extrasensory vision, the Cheshme Barzakhi or Cheshme Basirat, through which the mystic is supposed to see people in their true form. In addition, this passage makes it clear that a human Satan is not merely one who acts in ways that align with the traits of the accursed Iblis, that is, one who deceives and rebels against God. These actions also transmogrify and distort the human's form to make them resemble a Satan in the immaterial realm. There's something ontological about becoming satanic. It's not just about your qualities, it's something that transforms your very being. Khomeini did not, however, explain what a Satan looks like. And I'll have occasion to talk about this a little bit later when we talk about the cinematic Satan, where there have been attempts to speculate and represent Satan in cinematic form. Khomeini did not make a hard distinction between the Satans of political intrigue and the Satans of inner deviance. The two were clearly connected. In remarks to the cabinet of Prime Minister Raja'i in 1980, for example, he famously declared that whoever says me, this me is Satan. Haki bege man, in man shaitanist. In another speech to government officials in 1983, he argued that political infighting emerged from a flaw that humanity had inherited from Satan, a kind of original propensity towards sin. This is what he said. We have to struggle to fortify this spirituality and to suppress this selfhood as much as we can. If this is solved, everything will be solved. Discords are built on the same issue. There is no discord in the world that does not have this as its basis. From the first day, Satan said, "You created me out of fire, whereas you created him out of clay. I am better than him," meaning better than the human. He refused God and told God that I am better. This satanic inheritance is an inheritance for all of us. The final sentence here, where human selfhood, or perhaps selffulness, nafsaniyat, is identified as a satanic inheritance, is extraordinary because it suggests that humans' propensity towards sin is directly connected to Iblis's primordial act of arrogance, his refusal to prostrate before Adam when God ordered him and the angels to do so. If humans inherited selffulness from Iblis, then Iblis is, in his original act of selffulness, the father of all humanity. This makes Iblis a much more intimate figure than the image of the accursed seducer typically makes him out to be. Khomeini seemed to be suggesting that humans are seducible precisely because they all have something of Iblis in them. Now, Ayatollah Khomeini was not the only revolutionary leader to think deeply about Satan's complex character. While his satanological framework proved the most compelling in the years after 1979, other ideas remained hidden in its shadows. Perhaps the most important of these was a paradoxical approach to Satan developed by Ali Shariati. Shariati imagined Satan as a tragic, contradictory character whose travails could be harnessed to a humanist reading of Adam's fall and his subsequent reunion with God. He read the Quranic story of Iblis and his relationship with Adam and Eve through a framework indebted to the Indian subcontinent philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, with inspiration from early Sufis like Hallaj and Ain al-Ghazat Hamedani, as well as European thinkers from Milton to Nietzsche, Sartre, and Heidegger. Through both overt comparison and subtle allusions and turns of phrase, Shariati suggested affinities between human courage and freedom and Satan's refusal of the divine command. The bulk of Shariati's reflections on Satan appears in an essay titled Hubut, The Descent, written in 1969. It is among his self-described desert writings, Kaviriyat, reflections of a mystical or even ecstatic character written in passionate prose and laden with complex, sometimes cryptic symbolism. Hubut is a first-person account of the creation of primordial man, his fall, and his subsequent struggle to reunite with God. The essay has been read as a spiritual autobiography written in code, as well as a philosophical meditation on human self-consciousness and freedom. Now, Hubut's not the only place where he talks about Satan, and there's other essays and other lectures that Shariati gave where he talked about Satan, and some of them are at odds with what I'm going to give you. What I'm presenting is one version of the way that Shariati thought about Satan, and I think one of the more interesting and neglected aspects of how he thought about this. What I'd like to focus on here is how Shariati figures Satan as an ally of humanity. Early in the essay, the primordial man who narrates the story offers a moving account of the pre-eternal covenant, in which God asks all of creation whether he is not their Lord. Every created being answers in unison, yes, indeed, you are. Then God begins to write down the fate of every speck. This is in the Alam Zar, this kind of pre-eternal space where every created being is in the form of a speck. So God looks at every speck and writes down their fate, casting his warm and loving glance upon them in turn. When he faces the primordial man, God's glance turns brighter, warmer, more loving, in Shariati's words. His face, says man, was the face of a kindly father who conceals his laughter and secretly revels in the deviltry of his rebellious but lovable child. Now, the word that I've rendered here as deviltry is shaitanat, which is derived from shaitan and means mischief, often referring to playfulness of a childish or coquettish sort. Shariati ties mischief and deviltry to human rebellion, which is significant that given that only a few paragraphs later, he narrates Satan's defiant refusal to prostrate before mankind. He's clearly making a connection between the shaitanat of primordial man and the shaitanat of the devil. In God's eyes, man is rebellious like Satan, and yet lovable. We see a hint of what Shariati means by this in his account of how God offers all his creation his trust, or amana, symbolized in the form of a great fire in Shariati's telling. In the well-known Quranic story that Shariati elaborates, the human is the only one who undertakes to bear the trust. But this is a wild, fiery entity that every other creature had recognized as terrifying and unbearable. Mankind is, quote, foolish and wicked to have accepted it. This is directly from the Quran. And yet by accepting it, man takes up something divine with which he attains his full potential and through which he rules the earth. Shariati builds on this foundational Islamic premise by arguing that the trust granted to mankind is a divine power to self-create and to create the world. right? So in the Quran, it's not totally clear what amana actually is, right? And there's all this speculation by exegetes and theologians to understand, well, what is it that the Quran means by the amana? Shariati says it's a divine power to self-create and to create the world. As he writes in another essay, by virtue of taking on the divine trust, man becomes a demigod, a lonely, exiled theomorph. The Persian words he uses are shibh khuda and khudagune. There's more to this account than what has been conventionally espoused in Islamic theology. Shariati's description of the trust as a fire alludes directly to the myth of Prometheus. Elsewhere, he compares Satan's transgression in offering the fruit of knowledge to Adam and Eve with Prometheus's offering of the stolen fire to humanity, a parallel with which he was likely familiar from his readings of Nietzsche, the European Romantics, or even the more proximate work of Zwi Verblovsky. Shariati's understanding of Satan also overlapped significantly with that of Muhammad Iqbal, whom he deeply admired. Like Shariati, Iqbal saw the expulsion of Adam and Eve from heaven as a first step towards self-consciousness. I hope you're not hearing that helicopter out there. Further, he thought that Satan's daring spirit breathed ambition into the dust of man, his mind and reason having been woven of Satan's sedition. In Iqbal's language, a satanic spark makes of man a creative self-maker, self-demolisher, and self-regulator. Shariati's paradoxical Satan was a world apart from Khomeini's tripartite image of the Accursed One as an ethical, mystical, and political exemplar of evil. For Khomeini, after all, Satan is evil. Khomeini's vision left no space for a morally ambiguous account of Satan that kept redemption open as a possibility, much less one that celebrated his rebellious refusal of the divine command. For Shariati, by contrast, Satan's Promethean revolt was a model to emulate as the prototypical act of negation, even if he also blamed human wickedness on his satanic inheritance and agreed that Satan's jealousy caused his downfall. There is at least one point on which Khomeini and Shariati converged. When Khomeini said that whoever says me, this me is Satan, his words enabled an equation of Satan with the self-sustaining I, which Shariati would not have found objectionable. The difference between them was that one strove to obliterate the human self in God, while the other sought the apotheosis of human selfhood. It was the self itself that would become God. For Khomeini, the path to union with God lay in negating the self, after which the spiritual aspirant would become a vessel for divine words and deeds. Shariati agreed that the self should be negated, but only so that a new self-creative self could take its place in full self-consciousness. He declared that this moment was one in which existentialism begins, and Nietzsche's nihilism and the Hegelian process of the absolute idea attaining self-consciousness come true. Khomeini's vision of Satan as me was conducive to his construction of a revolutionary polity because God's state would rise higher as his pious followers negated themselves in God and subordinated themselves to his state. Shariati's satanic me, on the other hand, could certainly have been a powerful energizer of revolutionary self-assertion and self-determination. But had he lived to see the republic that rose from the revolutionary ferment, it's doubtful he would have been content to see people surrender their rebellious creativity to a new political apparatus. In the end, it was Khomeini's articulation that captured the public imagination of Satan from the late 70s and came to define official discourse from 1979 onward. But in the decades after Khomeini's death, no leader has managed to replicate the synthesis that he wrought between political rhetoric, ethical instruction, and mystical vision. Hence, while Satan continues to perform discursive labor as a political slogan, the Accursed One no longer retains the spiritual vitality of the Khomeini era. The repetitions of his name have taken on a compulsiveness whose vacuity only highlights the void left by Khomeini's death. As the political Satan lost its spiritual vitality after 1989, the ethical Satan was denied a political orientation that Khomeini had once commanded through his speech as master enunciator. In the meantime, anxieties about the satanic seeped into the very heart of revolutionary theology. In my book, I show, for example, how Satan contaminates the messianism of the revolution, the way in which speculation about the Mahdi's advent and his fulfillment of the revolution's eschatological promise are susceptible to the suspicions of deception and self-delusion. And I have to pay tribute here to Professor Amonat's work, because it's been so inspiring in my thinking about the Mahdi and Mahdism in Iran. In a separate chapter, I show how faith in divine support, most dramatically in the form of miracles and invisible aid, has gradually evaporated from official discourse, opening space instead for anxieties about divine punishments like earthquakes and pandemics, and about political sorcery and the loss of moral agency. I'll just say one word about the images here. So what you see on the left, the false claimants, Modda'iyan Durughin, that comes from a website that was reporting about claimants to Mahdihood, which there's been a lot of over the past 2 decades. And then on the right, you also see it was another website that was criticizing Ahmad al-Hassan, the Iraqi claimant to the eschatological precursorhood of the Imam Mahdi. How Satan's power should be discovered and confronted, and who should be blamed for his enhanced presence, become altogether more pressing questions when the Almighty God seems to have withdrawn his helping hand. And I'm referring here to a chapter I've written about how you have a kind of a shift over the revolutionary period, from the early revolutionary period, especially during Khomeini's lifetime, from a lot of investment in the miraculous and in direct interventions by God in history. There's a shift from that towards increasing anxiety that perhaps God isn't as active in revolutionary politics as we would wish him to be. And perhaps he has even washed his hands, or there's a danger that he will wash his hands from the revolutionary project. And you see this in, I'm arguing, you see this in anxieties about earthquakes, about most recently the pandemic, but also about things like politicians having been bewitched, most famously in the case of Ahmadinejad in 2011. I now want to show you some ways in which Satan continues to be manifest in Iranian public life, and how these manifestations both resonate with and depart from Khomeini and Shariati's enunciations. If Khomeini managed to articulate Satan's figure as simultaneously ethical, mystical, and political, these newer manifestations are limited to only 1 or 2 of these dimensions. Together, however, they give us a sense of how Satan's presence has both fragmented and expanded in public discourse, encroaching on entirely new territory. So I want to begin with the cinematic Satan. Recall Khomeini's words that humans may take on a satanic form by their evil deeds. This form would be perceptible in the immaterial realm after death, or in this life, for those mystics gifted with extrasensory vision. While Khomeini did not give any indication of what Satan looked like, there have been several filmic experiments in visualizing Satan in the past 2 decades. These explorations share a commitment to verisimilitude and theological correctness, as well as a stated intent to use film for ethical instruction. And all of this is, of course, added to a concern with actual entertainment. And the problem then is how to balance all of that and succeed in doing all of it. We might think of them then, these experiments then, as attempts to re-articulate Satan's ethical significance through a new medium. Starting in the early 2000s, Iranian state television and the Culture Ministry's Farabi Cinema Foundation sponsored explorations of supernatural entities like Satan, angels, the souls of the dead, and the marvels of saintly figures. These projects were shot through with intellectual concern with the problem of representing ma'ana, a concept that was understood both as meaning and spirit. So you had, it was formally, one of the ways in which these explorations were described was in terms of sinamaya ma'ana gera, meaning-oriented or spirit-oriented. They themselves translated as spiritual cinema. Hollywood productions played an outsized role in this cinematic imaginary, followed by movies that owed their fame to the global circuits of prestigious festivals. European existentialist films and Hollywood fantasy, science fiction, and horror would thus become commensurable with the mystical cinema of Iranian auteurs like Majid Majidi, Reza Mir Karimi, and Kamal Tabrizi. These are some of the films. What you're seeing now are some of the films that were broadcast on Channel 4's Cinema and Metaphysics series, beginning, I believe, in 2006 or 2005. I don't remember the exact date. One of the most ambitious cinematic productions to emerge from this period was The Kingdom of Solomon the Prophet, a big-budget Quranic epic directed by Shahriyar Bahrani and screened nationwide in 2010. Kingdom was the most expensive Iranian movie to be made up to that point, with funding to the tune of around 5 billion tomans approved by Parliament in 2004, which at the time would have been around $6 million US. And I say up to that point because Majid Majidi's film about the Prophet Muhammad, which was made a few years later, that was even more expensive. The film was also the boldest attempt of its kind at anchoring Satan on new ground in a manner that was theologically correct and morally instructive, while satisfying audience expectations for visual realism and dramatic attraction. Kingdom was planned as the first of a trilogy, although its sequels are yet to be made after a decade. Part 1, which is the only one that's been screened so far, treats the early years of Solomon's rule over Jerusalem and its surrounding territories as he confronts the challenge of mutinous tribes instigated by a corrupt Jewish priesthood. Solomon receives divine revelation that his kingdom will soon face terrifying tribulations caused by jinn and satans, whose realm is impinging on the human world. The film sets up a clash between Solomon and his faithful followers on one side, and Satan and his minions, a sorcerer and a corrupt priesthood on the other. The research team behind Kingdom claimed that although jinn and satans are normally invisible, they materialized during Solomon's era and may do so again at the end of time. They also explored the ways in which Satan has been depicted in the Islamic tradition. The most detailed version they cited recounts a meeting between Satan and Yahya, the prophet, who's equated usually with John the Baptist. Yahya asks Satan to show himself in, quote, his form and creation, and Satan obliged. According to the tradition, Satan had a, quote, misshapen, inverted, ugly, terrifying face. His body resembled those of swine. He was crooked and lame, possessing 2 wings and 4 hands, 2 at his shoulders and 2 at his sides, each containing 6 fingers, his toes protruding backwards and his heels to the front. His face was like apes, the slit of his eyes vertical, his eyes dim-sighted, his mouth vertical and long, his teeth all one bone, chinless and beardless, the hair on his head slightly grown upwards, his cheeks hard and smooth, and his nose shaped like a bird's beak. Now, Satan never actually appears in Kingdom of Solomon except for one ambiguous scene at the beginning, which I'm going to show you right now.
ای از ما بهتران ای قدرتمندان ای میترایی ها ای حاکمان نهان ای سیاهی ها بر کار بود ضعیف مخالفین تسلط یابید و آنان را به کامتان فرو برید چه سجده نکرده و نمی کند پس شما خدمتگزارانش را فرا میخوانم
Okay, in case you're wondering, Mehdi Faqih did win the Crystal Seymour for Best Supporting Actor for this role, the role of the sorcerer. Besides this one scene, there are indications that the filmmakers had planned to introduce Satan in a sequel. The film's website went so far as to feature a computer-generated rendition of the Accursed One in chains, with a misshapen body and an ape-like face, but otherwise unlike the form that the Prophet Yahya ostensibly witnessed. While Kingdom's website anchored the film's cinematic choices in the Islamic tradition, its computer-generated images resonated with fantastical depictions of otherworldly beings in Hollywood and elsewhere. There is a direct reason for this similarity, and it's not just that they were borrowing the forms from Hollywood. In an interview shortly after Kingdom's release, the film's producer Mujtaba Faravarde explained its depiction of jinn by claiming that these beings have stable, perceptible physical qualities. The jinn can take on any shape, he said, but their ordinary form and their features are only one. Why do you think these examples that the Westerners produce are all the same? Why do they all have pointy ears? It's because this is one of the physical features of jinn. Their ears are all the same. How he knows this, I don't know. More importantly, Faravarde argued that the fantasy Hollywood films whose creation was typically attributed to the imagination of this or that filmmaker are inspired directly by jinn and satans. Western cinema is practically in the hands of the jinn and satans, he said. Their cinema is constantly introducing us to their world in the name of imagination. Inspirations are from God, but insinuations and whispers, vasvasaha, are not from God. They're from the jinn and satans. Do you think that, for example, Avatar really came out of Mr. James Cameron's brain? The strongest American strategists are behind this film. The Lord of the Rings and the Harry Potters are the same. It is Satan's support. You might also notice some parallels here between this kind of understanding and some Christian evangelical talk about Harry Potter, witchcraft in films, and so on. Not exactly the same, but there are parallels. One crucial but unstated implication here is that by viewing Hollywood fantasy cinema, a committed Muslim filmmaker can draw true inferences about what the jinn and satans look like. But if it is Satan's support that makes a particular depiction of the Accursed One commonplace, how does this method ensure that Islamic cinema is not also contaminated by satanic insinuation? While this question was not taken up by film critics to the best of my knowledge, many of them did take issue with the religious ideas at the core of Kingdom, some going as far as accusing the film of lies, deviance, and New Age falsities. More commonly, however, the critics poured scorn on the movie for simply being bad. The veteran critic Masoud Ferasati, for example, blasted Kingdom for its lack of story and character development. It was, he said, an awful and ridiculous film that made even his 8-year-old child laugh. Attempts to revive Satan's ethical figure through cinema and television went on for about 8 years, but none fared much better than Kingdom. In almost every case, discussions of Satan's ethical significance were overshadowed by debates over cinematic representation and theological correctness. At best, the efforts were criticized as bad filmmaking. At worst, the critics accused the filmmakers of doing more harm than good. Around the same time that state television and the culture ministry were promoting filmic explorations of the satanic, a new kind of anxiety emerged about Satan worship. Several right-wing authors and public speakers took aim at Hollywood cinema for promoting Satanism. They also criticized Iranian policymakers and film producers for being easily tricked and seduced by these films. In the aftermath of the controversial presidential election of 2009, criticisms of Hollywood Satanism sometimes melded with a more diffuse right-wing anxiety about the circulation of satanic emblems and practices. Anti-Satanist activists noticed suspicious signs, like triangles, broken crosses, and the eye of Lucifer everywhere, on public buildings, subway murals, middle school textbooks, clothing, and jewelry. In February 2010, Tehran police announced that it was banning a popular air freshener in the shape of a black rectangle with a large white X on its face because it carried a symbol of Kabbalism and Satan worship. For a brief period, right-wing activists and bloggers even worried that the newly constructed Majlis building expressed Masonic and Satanist meanings because it was designed in the shape of a pyramid. In the meantime, the media carried police reports about the proliferation of Satan-worshipping cults, in which young men and women danced to heavy metal music, performed grotesque and violent rituals, consumed alcohol and illegal drugs, and engaged in dangerous sexual behavior. The anti-Satanists formulated their criticisms in terms of a worry over foreign influence and the corruption of a pious Muslim interior. The principal narrative about satanic signs was that they silently advertised Satanism and insinuate themselves into the minds of their beholders in order gradually to infect them with doubt, irreligion, and immorality. In some formulations, these tokens were imbued with a supernatural talismanic force mediated by demonic otherworldly beings. In the most alarmist accounts, the emblems foretold cataclysmic events yet to come. For example, Ali Akbar Raifipur, a public speaker with a cult following among right-wing student groups, claimed that the X in the banned air freshener signified the imminent manifestation of Satan and enslavement to his rule. That the sign should be circulating so openly, he claimed, could only be a herald of the end times and Masonic plans to institute a new world order. In case you're curious about what this X air freshener actually was, I've dug it up and I found out, and I actually have one of them in my office here. It's actually probably a knockoff of promotional merchandise for the Malcolm X film made by Spike Lee in 1992. I've actually written about this in an article in Comparative Islamic Studies that came out last year. If you want to see kind of the analysis that I did there about you know, how it is that we can reconcile kind of the Islamic Republic's interest in Malcolm X and valorization of Malcolm X with this kind of anxiety. One way to understand contemporary anti-Satanism might be to interpret it as a new attempt to incarnate political community against a demonic outside. To this political intention, we might add a kind of extrasensory mystical vision, insofar as anti-Satanism is premised on discerning signs with occult significance. But just as the recent cinematic depictions of Satan have drawn on American films for inspiration, anti-Satanism also draws liberally on American evangelicalism and white supremacist conspiracy theory. Among other things, anti-Satanists borrowed the concept of a new world order from American right-wing populists and Christian fundamentalists preoccupied with the looming apocalypse. The very epistemology and methodology of anti-Satanist detective work, hunting for visual tokens in public places as proof of conspiracy, was imported from abroad. Even the inventory of satanic emblems, which appeared on countless anti-Satanist blogs and was displayed at university events on Satanism, was translated from a handful of English language sources like the Christian fundamentalist web forum exposingsatanism.org. This is a screenshot of that website. Obviously, the Star and Crescent is a rather newer edition in the past, I would say like 5 or 6 years. And obviously that hasn't translated in Iran, but the rest of it has. Its ambitions aside, contemporary anti-Satanism has neither managed to command much ethical weight, nor succeeded at constituting political community beyond its own paranoid circles. Instead, anti-Satanist accusations have turned on community itself, gnawing away at its fabric like so many ferocious demons. Nowhere is this clearer than in the demonization of heavy metal musicians. In no small part due to the activities of anti-Satanist groups over the past 2 decades, Iranian metalheads have often faced constraint, harassment, and even prosecution by police and the judiciary. Now, over the past year, I've been doing research on the heavy metal scene and interviewing musicians and fans of the genre. While anti-Satanists frequently charge heavy metal music with promoting Satanism, I have yet to find an Iranian musician who fits that label in the way that it's common in North America and Europe, for example. However, I do think that Iranian heavy metal presents opportunities to reflect on Satan in new and interesting ways. While now this part of my research is the most speculative and it's still ongoing, I'm still interviewing folks, and I've yet to draw any definite conclusions, but I do want to end my talk with a few examples for further reflection. One way in which we might intuit Satan's presence in some Iranian heavy metal is through apparently blasphemous speech. This is the kind of music that comes closest to fitting the anti-Satanist caricature, and it's also the sort of music that has most frequently captured the attention of the Western media. A good example is a song by Confess, a band whose core members, Nikan Sianur Khosravi and Arash Chemical Ilkhani, were arrested in 2015 and sentenced to prison. Both men were granted asylum in Norway and took up residence there while appealing their sentences. I want to play a section of their song, I Am Your God Now, from 2015, shortly before their arrest. One thing I'll just explain is that at some point you'll see the lyrics appear on the left. These are in English. Like most heavy metal in Iran, this is a song which is in English, and the lyrics I've taken directly from their own presentation. I haven't modified it at all. Let's listen.
And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger. And you will know my name is the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon thee.
Fast forward a little bit to where the actual vocals begin. Okay. Like much of Confess's music before their departure to Norway, I Am Your God Now expresses youthful rage at oppression, corruption, and alienation. The blasphemous self-deification of the vocalist reads less as a challenge to God or Islam than an inversion of existing relations of domination in which the musicians take the state to be acting like a god over its citizens. The song is, in the end, a revenge fantasy, not a theological statement. In my view, this is the last place we should be looking for Satan. My second example shows how the satanic might allow for an exploration of depression, anxiety, and alienation. The song is titled Nahs, sinister or malevolent, and was written and recorded by the band Padra, which, by the way, has actually performed several times with a license in Tehran. The song is told from the perspective of a demonic presence that has possessed someone. This one is in Persian, and you'll see my translation on the left once the vocals begin. So here, Satan is a figure who makes it possible to explore the darkest recesses of a being in pain. There's no judgment here for or against Satan, only a dwelling in and with the demonic to understand something about human experience. That brings me finally to my last example, Khoruz Fisanjan by Mohammad Mousavi, who's one of my favorite Iranian heavy metal musicians. It is a darkly humorous story about a pesky rooster who annoys the whole neighborhood until they hunt him down, chop him up, and cook him into a stew of Fisanjan. I'll play you just the last bit of the song. This is the cover art, by the way.
از اعماق وجودش یافت آغاز و آن لحظه آخر که تقلای شدیدش یافت پایان. خروزد تنش آغشته به خون و سرش افتاده یه ور بود، قرمز شده جوم و در آن دم چه مگزهای حریصی که نشستن روی چشمان غمینش، روی بالش، روی پرهای قشنگش، روی پاها، روی گردن، روی کاکل، روی تاج و دگر اجزای وجودش. فنجان وای بر من، مرغان هراسان وای بر من، یه دونه خروس و کل محل جدید و پیاز وای بر من.
Okay. Satan appears nowhere in this song, but Mousavi gives us a gleeful meditation on violence, blood, decay, and at the same time, the pleasure of food, all matched up with some sexual innuendo on the cover art for the piece, which suggests to me that a reflection on Satan would be very much appropriate. I'll just leave you with the reflection that the themes of bloodlust, decay, and appetite for animal flesh resonate with the story of Zahak in the Shahnameh, and specifically Ahriman's appearance in the guise of a master chef who feeds the formerly vegetarian king the flesh of animals, thereby driving him to mass murder. Perhaps here again, heavy metal is probing some of the darker corners of human experience, except it does so in such a masterful way that it makes the listener complicit with its own playful deviltry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alireza. This was truly an exceptional presentation, very rich and inspiring. I will start with some questions before our attendees will send in their questions, perhaps just to warm up. In my introduction, I talked about the truly radical and creative approach you have in your work, in particularly in its disciplinary component of your work. And I think you are touching new horizons with your new work. And moving from texts that are usually are seen to belong to the realm of the highbrow to popular manifestations of the Accursed One. And but I wanted to know that it is true that the sort of rewards that come with that kind of approach, but what about the dangers that are there? For instance, specifically, I want to talk about the question of intertextuality, in the sense that it is true that all texts are connected to all texts before them, but they are particularly connected to texts within their own genre. So if Ayatollah Khomeini writes his discourse on Satan, it comes within the context of a very rich tradition of the Illuminationist philosophy, as you mentioned, and reflections that have been produced for centuries within that tradition. And Shariati, what you brought up about Shariati was truly amazing and informing. Shariati, in a sense, has a different kind of intertext at the same time, not completely disconnected from what Khomeini does, but, and then when we move on to TV series and films, in some ways, you could say even Managara, although it emerged from Iran in such a clear fashion, it does engage in dialogue with a certain notion of the Iranian cinema that is produced internationally, meaning that a certain preference for spirituality and so on. So what I want to know is that, would that separation of intertext make it difficult? How do you face that kind of difficulty?
Yeah, thank you. it is a difficulty. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think something that pushes me to try to face the challenge is that we see a lot of resonance and kind of cross genre and cross, I guess you could say, textual corpus types of intertextuality, right? So even though Ayatollah Khomeini was writing Chel Hadith, what is it? It would have been in the 1930s, the late 1930s. You know, these are texts that people still read today. You see a preacher come on television and speak about the ethics, everyday ethics, and the relationship with God and how to overcome Satan and so on. There are clear kind of resonances with, you know, with what Khomeini was writing at the time. And when it comes to TV series and spiritual cinema and so on, there's also very explicit attempt to connect those to some of these discussions, right? Like how do we think about the very idea of representing the unrepresentable or representing something that cannot be seen, the unseen, right? The ghaib. And a lot of that happens through engagement with mystical philosophy, with illuminationism, as you suggested. There's, you know, partly some of it goes through Murtaza Avini's work and engagement with his thinking on this topic, and others that go in different directions. So that, you know, for me, what's exciting is that even though each of these texts, as it were, and films and genres of music and so on, do have their own little worlds in which they need to be absolutely situated in the histories within which, you know, those worlds have developed. There's also very clear resonance and interconnection between them. And the challenge really is to make that work, and we'll see if I succeed or not. I think it's certainly a challenge that I'd like to attempt. The other thing I'll say is part of what I'm trying to do in this book, which is a bit different from the first book, is to engage, as I said in the introduction, in some theological work. And that would require me to go beyond certain parameters and kind of conventions of anthropological writing as it's typically understood, and to do things that maybe would not entirely be obliged to conform to certain norms of say empiricist and positivistic you know, commitment. And that's something that I'm still working through. Right, and we'll see how that works.
Yeah, and if I may add as a sort of a little comment before we get to the questions, is that to me, the filmmaker behind the Kingdom of Solomon, his comment about that the reason that jinns and demonic figures appear the same from one film to another is actually his failure to recognize intertextuality, because he sees the repetition of those characteristics as a proof that there is some relationship to the reality behind that. So if I may, I will now move on to the questions that keep coming in. And the first question is that, to what extent do younger Iranians identify with these conceptions of Satan?
With which ones? I mean, I've presented very many of them, right? So the point here is for me to say there isn't one conception of Satan. There's a lot of them, and there's very different ways of identifying with them. So if you are interested, the essay that I mentioned about, which touches in part on the X-air freshener, but is more broadly about spiritual cinema in Iran, there's a discussion I have in there of identification, right? What does it even mean to identify? And it's a very complicated question that we might approach through psychoanalysis, and there's other ways of approaching it as well. You know, if what is meant is, do young people have a kind of straightforward, you know, let's say pious understanding of Satan in the way that Khomeini articulates? I think yes in some cases, and no in many other cases, right? Certainly the heavy metalers are not working with that conception of Satan. You know, for them, Satan might not exist at all as an actual supernatural entity, but might still be worth exploring in their music for a variety of reasons, like what I mentioned about the way in which Satan allows you to probe various dimensions of human existence. And similarly with the films, I think some of these films have been quite successful, others not. You can see ways in which identification has worked in very complicated ways. There's one TV series called Panj Kilometr Ta Behesht, which was about these disincarnated souls that are walking around trying to figure out who tried to kill one of them. And there was a kid who tried to hang himself and actually died from brain death, from injury, from trying to hang himself in order to get his soul to leave his body. Now, this was an 11-year-old, but it was also, it was a TV series that families were watching all across the country. And you get very different reactions to what it is that they're taking out of these, they're getting from these films. Are they just being entertained? Are they also learning something? Are they subscribing to certain ethical teachings from this material? Are there other things going on? And it's there's no singular answer to that. It's really a wide field.
Thank you. And one other question, wanted the person who posted it wanted to know if you can tell us more about the relationship between Shariati and Hallaj's thoughts.
Yeah, I won't attempt an answer to that question. I think where let me say a couple things. One is that the Shariati explicitly evokes Hallaj, right, in Hubut. And there is a way in which in Hubut, he is thinking about Satan as a kind of a tragic monotheist, right? So in that sense, there is a resonance with Hallaj and there's a resonance with Ainul Ghazat. But he's not, strictly speaking, he's not limiting himself to kind of a tradition of reflection on Satan that we might think, that we might connect to Hallaj, right? So there's ways in which much more recent kinds of reflection on Satan that are more modernist and humanist in orientation has influenced the way I think he's reading Hallaj, right? So Iqbal is really key here, but so are Nietzsche and Hegel and Sartre and others.
We have a number of questions by Dr. William Beeman. I'm sure you are familiar with his work and perhaps personally also. I will start with his second question, which is more related to your last one. Would you comment on the theological view of Sufism in the context of anti-Satanist philosophy? Sufism has been widely attacked by conservative Iranian theologians. Have they tied this to Satanism so to solidify their attacks?
That's an interesting question. There are I had a picture that I showed early on with the covers of a lot of books, and many of those books are anti-Satanist books. One thing that anti-Satanist texts tend to do is begin with a discussion of the history of Satanism, and sometimes that history of Satanism includes a reference to some Sufi formulations like Hallaj's. They don't tend to take up a lot of space because the authors tend to want to go immediately to Western Satanism, so they don't tend to spend a lot of time thinking about that. There is a kind of what your question gives me the opportunity to say something else, which is that there is also Sufi heavy metal, in the sense that there are heavy metal musicians, like I think his name is his last name is Arabi, if I'm not mistaken, who Farshid Arabi maybe, who has heavy metal music where he sings poetry from Rumi and from other Sufi poets. And it's part of a broader landscape where, I mean, Nahid Siamdoust has done a really wonderful job kind of laying the landscape of Iranian rock and metal and pop and rap and so on, music, and how they've interacted with the Persian poetic tradition. So there is also rock and sort of hard rock where Sufi music has gotten picked up. I haven't seen as much of this kind of anti-Sufism brought into the picture. And I mean, there's also the problem of what exactly we would call Sufism, right? Because we're talking about an official political discourse that does valorize mysticism, except really doesn't want to call it Sufism.
Another question here is that whether Khomeini's views of Satan are the same or different from the idea of Yazid used during Ashura for centuries, at least since the Safavid period.
Meaning, I take that to mean whether Yazid is being equated with Satan. So, you know, I think certainly in this kind of theological framework, Yazid would be a Satan, right? A human Satan. But I think in the broader, you know, if we kind of think about it as a broader category, then at least in Khomeini's thought, you'd have to see it in that tripartite way that I laid out between the ethical, the mystical, and the political. Now, these are not self-contained categories, right? I'm using it heuristically. The ethical could also be mystical. The mystical could be ethical. The political is not a separate category. I just think it's useful to sort of think of three different axes on which Satan appears. So in that sense, you know, I don't think Yazid would exactly overlap. I think Satan would be a much broader, you know, it's not just an individual, right? It's a figure that allows all this kind of theological, ethical, mystical, political thinking and action at the same time.
There's a rather long question, but a very interesting one in a sense that it connects to other work you have produced and to your other presentations. I'll try to summarize it. The person posing the question wants to know if there is a comparison between the Iranian discourse around Satan and the white supremacist conspiracy theories in the United States. Is there only point of comparison with white supremacist Christian evangelicals? Have you looked into non-conspiracy theory?
I'm sorry, the last 10 seconds I dropped. Have you looked at?
Into non-white versions of conspiracy theories? And it goes on. Are there overlaps between, let's say, the 5%ers in the United States and state discourse in Iran?
Right. I haven't looked at that. It's possible. So, you know, I have that one article where I've done this, and the chapter in the book where I talk about this has not been written yet. It's just the article, so I still need to do more research. And, you know, thank you for suggesting that. I mean, I'm going to look into it. I think the overlaps that I see are, you know, there are several places where that overlaps becomes clear. One is in just the symbols, right? Like where are these symbols taken from? And it's very clear that it's through just a couple of Google searches. You put in Satanism or satanic symbols, and the same kinds of things that are often circulating in the Iranian public, the same things come up in white supremacist and evangelical, and they're not the same thing, right? I don't want to say they're the same, but they overlap sometimes. You know, the same kinds of things appear there. The other way, I think, is that there are certain figures who have been cited in Iran directly or interviewed, who, even though they're not engaged in anti-Satanism per se, some of their kind of ideas have found an audience, right? And they've been engaged with in Iran. So, you know, the most kind of notorious of these is David Duke. You know, he was interviewed a few times over the past couple decades. Mark Webber also, you know, these are both, you know, they're typically called white supremacists, I think rightly so. And you know, so they're known to a certain kind of subsegment of Iranians, and I think for me that's a reason to suspect that much of this is coming from there. But I don't think that's all there is to it, right? And I'd like to learn more, really. And the 5%ers is a really super interesting possibility to explore. So thank you for that.
So if I may push a little bit more, so you could talk about the things that I've heard you talk about in other places. I remember, if my memory is not failing me, that you refer to this sort of overlaps between the fringe hardline groups in Iran and certain right-wing groups in the United States as a form of cosmopolitanism. To me, that was very interesting to see that how you sort of so unabashedly put aside all claims to Iranian exceptionalism. And I personally would have liked to see the connections with the European ones also, not necessarily with somebody like David Duke, but also with figures in Europe who have or had some sort of a semi-academic positions through their lifetimes also. So there is that kind of a dialogue there as well. Would you like to continue?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
The choice of the word cosmopolitanism, especially, I found this particularly daring and revealing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the point that I was trying to make in that essay, which is the same one I keep referring to, is that you know, if we think about cosmopolitanism as a kind of openness to difference, that difference could be cultural, it could be religious, and otherwise. You know, there's a lot of ways in which you can see Iranian cosmopolitanism, and if you just look at discussions and speculations around spiritual cinema, it both takes on the form of openness to Hollywood and antagonism to Hollywood, and in both cases you see a certain kind of cosmopolitan sort of thrust in play. And I think the European connection is, again, it's really interesting to look at. I haven't done much of that. I think one way that I would like to do that is through thinking about the Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie's book, and its reception, and the kind of the circles in which the reactions to that developed from the 80s. And you know, that would take us to places other than the North American kind of scene. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Again, this is, you know, this is both the kind of the advantage and the disadvantage of a project that's still ongoing. So I'm hugely benefiting from this.
I'm glad you brought up the Satanic Verses on your own, because we had two questions regarding that. One is that whether the stories in the Satanic Verses in any ways are related to certain ancient Persian folkloric tales.
That's easy. I don't know.
They are probably to some.
Yeah.
And so another question I want to bring up by Dr. Kevin Van Bloedel, a member of faculty here at Yale. The question goes as, do you find any discourse in Iran between fine-grained distinctions of heavy metal corresponding to different deployments of Satan? So basically, whether there are different sort of genres within heavy metal are being recognized in Iran. So Pedra sounds to me like thrash metal, Musavi sounds like new progressive metal, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, within the heavy metal community, those distinctions are super important. There's endless conversation about which genre, who fits into, and, you know, which one is better than the other, and, you know, all this stuff. And whether that includes also a conversation about Satan, I haven't seen as much of that. So one would think, for example, that in death and black metal, you would see a more unabashed kind of engagement with Satan. And I haven't really seen that yet. So there's another death metal band that got in trouble recently called Arsames. They have a song called Immortal Identity, and they do this kind of, you know, they sing all of their songs through the growl and, you know, or the, what is it called? Like the devil's screech, or I mean, not the screech, but the growl. And, but it's actually, when you listen to it, it's a kind of a valorization of Iranian nationalism and a kind of a throwback to the Achaemenids, right? So he sings about how, you know, with this kind of growly voice, the lead singer says he's, you know, he's the first teacher of human rights, right? So it's not, I wouldn't say it's Satanist. In a sense, it's anti-Satanist. And I have yet to see, this is not to say they're not there, but I have yet to see any group explicitly take up that mantle and say, or that label and say, yes, we are Satanists, fantastic, hail Satan, you know, all this stuff. I haven't seen that. It could just be because of the atmosphere, right? I mean, there is already all this accusation. Every heavy metaler has to deal with that kind of sword hanging over their heads, that accusation hanging over their heads. I mean, with all this, it's kind of remarkable to me that there are musicians who still even get permits to perform, like Padra, right? And like others who have gotten it. Mousavi has also performed occasionally. So that's pretty interesting. And when I, you know, usually in my interviews, when I bring it up with them, when I ask about Satan, right, the answer I usually get is, yeah, you know, this is what they say about us. And some of them kind of wave it away in a jokey way. You know, Padra has this really, the band has a really nice interview where one of them says, yeah, you know, we have these little cups of blood we sort of hide away in our pockets and we sip it, right? Like when we have the opportunity. But it's all in this kind of jokey way, and they're in some way they're also happy. They like some of the negative attention because, you know, when it doesn't go too far, because it actually gets them more attention in a way that is, you know, heavy metal is not the biggest Iranian music scene, so it's a very small community. So, you know, sometimes it also works in paradoxical ways to their benefit.
It's a small community among the producers of the music, right? Because there are so many listeners of it.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the listeners are also musicians. If you actually want to listen more, there's an Instagram page on Iranian heavy metal. There's thousands of people there. It's a great page to follow to really get a good sense of the scene.
Yeah. So another question, this time from Matthew Melvin Kushki, probably a friend of yours again. Brilliant stuff, as always, he writes. Could you comment a bit more on the fascinating disconnect between the free importation of American evangelical anti-Satanist rhetoric on the one hand, and the importation of actual American Satanist occulticism on the other hand?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. I'll try. I know it's hard to kind of communicate back with him, but I'm not totally sure if he means that there isn't American Satanist occultism. You know, I think the import of anti-Satanism mostly happens in an unacknowledged way, right? So there's, on the one hand, people are not, you know, the people who are doing the importing aren't shy about the fact that this knowledge is out there. And it's like scientific knowledge, right? Whoever produces it, fabulous, who can use it. But there isn't this, at least the kind of the provenance of it, you know, the fact that this comes from evangelical discourse, or it comes from, you know, white supremacist discourse, that's typically hidden away. And I think it's embarrassing. I mean, you know, nobody wants to be associated with white supremacy, or, you know, be associated with evangelicalism. So yeah, but I'd have to think more about the kind of the American Satanism stuff and what, you know, what you were getting at there.
Okay, we have only a few more minutes, unfortunately. I would like to pass on the mantle to Dr. Amanat, see if he has any questions at the end.
Well, thank you very much for the chance to say a few words, and more than that, thanking Dr. Doostdar for the wonderful, very thought-provoking presentation. which raises many questions. And I suppose since we're at the end of our time, and I can see that there are quite a number of other questions that remains unanswered, and they're all very important. I try to be very brief. I listened to your talk, and something that a little bit puzzled me, how much one can see a connection between the first part, talking about Khomeini's moralist, perhaps Shariat is kind of a, I would call it pseudo-philosophical approach to the issue of the forces of Satan. And what we see in the post-revolutionary times, as you have very wonderfully described. Is there a way that you would be able to see that this whole discourse of Satan emerges or re-emerges in the post-revolutionary time, kind of independent from what we have heard during the revolution or prior to the revolution from persons such as Khomeini, which really harkens back to the long history of Muslims' preoccupation with the question of Shar, and probably to the pre-Islamic times as well. I wonder whether you have any thoughts on that.
That's a really great question, and it gets to the heart of something I'm trying to think through. So what my working kind of hypothesis has been that if we take Khomeini as a kind of a master enunciator who, manages to kind of bring together these three different ways of thinking about Satan and kind of, fundamentally shape public discourse in the early revolutionary period, that what we're seeing later can be understood as a kind of a fragmentation of that early formulation, right? Now, of course, it's a fragmentation that takes on other kinds of dimensions, like, with the anti-Satanists, I think what they have in common with Khomeini is this sort of attempt is the political Satan in a sense, right? It's like Satan as this, as the enemy, as the polluter, as the seducer, and all this kind of stuff. But then the way that Satan is characterized has very little, if anything, to do with the way theologically Satan is being understood, right? Mm-hmm. So my claim isn't that the anti-Satanists have the same idea as Khomeini, but it's more saying that there's a kind of an attempt to re-articulate Satan in a way that is politically and ethically sort of efficacious, and that has to, in a sense, it kind of follows the sort of the master, right? But it doesn't rise to the same, it doesn't succeed in the same way. Now, one could say maybe there's a complete disconnect, right? Maybe once Khomeini has passed away, there's just Satan is dead and buried, and then there's a kind of a rekindling of, that's something that I have to, I think about and kind of explore. It's a really interesting possibility. I think, with the cinematic Satan, it's interesting because there what's at work is not the political so much as the ethical and the mystical, right? So again, you see like two of the dimensions that Khomeini had things to say about, and they share certain characteristics of that, like the fact that, again, like Satan is seen as an obstacle to ethical striving, and then from the mystical side, that Satan is something that you can actually identify and see, right? And you can sort of discern its attributes. But of course, then it goes again in very different directions, and it's borrowing from Hollywood. It's inserted into an entirely new discourse. So I think I think I'd have to think about to what extent I'm actually committed to kind of retaining that arc. For now, I think I am, but whether it works or not, I think this still needs some more work. But I would love your suggestions.
Well, would it be possible to suggest that as the politicization of the Satan was actually taken over and monopolized by the state, the other forms of characterizations of Satan became kind of a counter-narrative to what the Islamic Republic would like to present to us or like to present to its own citizens.
I think certainly with, yes, I think certainly with the music, you can see this. With cinema and with TV series, I think it's a bit more complicated because these are themselves promoted by the state, right? And they're funded by the state. So like, you know, Kingdom of Solomon was funded by Parliament.
Yeah,
they
yeah.
had to, right?
Mm-hmm.
The TV series, similarly, they're being produced by state television. And at some point they stopped, right? And there's a lot of, there's many reasons for why they stopped. And I couldn't really get into it in the talk. But I think, you know, the fact of there is something about the political Satan running out of steam. And I think, you know, something I say in the kind of the longer version of this, that, you know, there's, you know, I talked briefly about a kind of compulsive repetition of Satan as this kind of political accusation, right? And which, you know, is completely ineffective right now. I think the seeds of that already existed in Khomeini's work, right? The way that's kind of Satan proliferates. It's like, it's the communists, it's the Kurds, it's the Americans, it's the Russians, it's the British, you know, it's the Arabs, everybody, you know. So it kind of, as far as the politics of it are concerned, as far as the political force is concerned, it already was kind of, I think, running out of steam then. But afterwards, there's really nobody who can kind of bring it all together except just in this kind of empty sort of formal way. So of course, once that happens, then yes, you have some of the other approaches then becoming more attractive.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I don't know, Fabud, it seemed to be at the end of our time, and we have this other wonderful questions.
It is immensely interesting, but I'm afraid we have our time limitations, and we should end it here. But to all the attendees, thank you so much for being there. And there are more Iran Colloquium series talk coming up soon. And if you visit our website, you can see the program in full. So thank you again, Dr. Doostdar. And I think we will end here.
Thank you.
Thank you.